I just have one question related to the communities inside the parks and now the revenues that you're generating from the tourism. So, how do they benefit from that directly? I mean, do you disperse it to the community groups, or how did
Yeah.
you manage to work that?
It's a little bit different country by country, park by park, depending on what the legislation is. Uh, it's something where when you start to take, if I say, a little bit of money and try to distribute over 50,000 people, 100,000 people, it actually ends up not being, it ends up being almost nothing to everyone. What's way more important is that you take that money to reinvest it into the machine that creates the sustainability of it. So someone was mentioning earlier about, give a man a fish, you feed him for the day, teach him how to fish, you feed him for life. Well, that's fine as long as the fisheries are sustainable. If the fisheries isn't sustainable, you've actually achieved nothing. So what that money goes into is in the sustaining the fishery to make sure it's sustainable so that the guy that you've taught how to fish can feed himself and his family for life. So that's the model behind what we do, rather than taking the money, distributing it, and then asking the global community just to keep pouring money in. Yeah. So it's just a different approach. But sometimes there is a formal revenue share, but only if that's legislated at a government level.
And you communicate with the communities on how much money's coming in and where.
Yeah. I mean, one of the key components of everything that we do is, number one, transparency, but the actual involvement, not just the transparency about what you've done, but the involvement of communities in decision making. And that happens at every level. So even at a board level that governs these individual projects, communities are represented in that so that they are at least part of the decision making that affects their livelihoods. Yeah. Okay.
We've spent a lot of today talking about partnerships, and I was hoping you could both talk a little bit about why partnerships such as this are still relatively rare amongst nonprofits. What are some of the challenges in partnering with organizations? I mean, this is obviously a grand success, but it's not that common that you hear about that.
Yeah.
I'll take a first stab at that. I think we're a health organization. We think health first. We talk health first, and our goal is to improve health. There's different languages in different sectors, and even though in my career I can't tell you how many times I have seen the place where health could be done paying attention to the environment and conservation or not paying attention. And if you only keep one goal, I think Gina is the one who said it's keeping that perspective of others as you're looking at your work. And most of the time, especially in our results-oriented American culture, it's head straight ahead, look straight ahead, accomplish the most you can for your goal. And when we share goals, we have to moderate, we have to compromise a little, and even though there's synergy that's greater, if I work in Central African Republic, there's a pretty small population, direly needy population. I could get more for my for my buck elsewhere, but in this place, I will be able to take people who are direly needing our help and help the conservation movement and help the animals. So we'll give a little, we'll get a lot, but it means you have to have the perspective of something besides your own narrow goals.
Yeah, I wish I could answer that, but if I could answer it well, we would have done these kinds of things, like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and we'd have 10 or 20 such relationships. This is our first, so it's something where that's our, one of our limitations, I think, is the recognition of the need, and I think also the honesty, maybe the humility of also knowing what you can do and what you can't do, sticking to what you're good at, being good at that, and then crowding in other organizations to be able to help where you're not very good at it. I mean, if I can just use the example of with Cyclone Ida in Mozambique, it was a terrible situation that they had. Now that happened to be 100 kilometers away from our park. Now we have helicopters, we have boats, we have rangers that are all very strong and very able. We were able to get out there and to deploy that. and get them in to be able to help. And we've got a partnership with Americares, and to my embarrassment, we kind of met you on the ground 100 kilometers away from our own park.
Right.
It's like it's hard, so it's like, okay, well, next time, let's make sure that at least where we operate and where Americares operate, that we've thought about these things and we're a whole lot better at it next time round, because the impact's going to be way greater.
I was curious, Peter, how will you evaluate the success of the partnership? What will be the measures by which you will judge success?
Yeah, good question. Do you want to go first again?
Sure.
No.
Yeah, okay.
It's everything that we do needs to come back to, if I say, our mission about making sure that these areas are there so that Michael's grandchildren, can be able to visit these areas and be able to benefit from them. So it isn't just being purely altruistic. It has to be linked back to the mission of the organization. So it's something where, how do we define that? We define that as building a constituency for conservation. So we as African Parks can say we want to protect these areas, it's important, it's good for climate change, blah, blah, blah. But it's something where it's more important that those local people living in and around the park, governments, society at that level does. So yeah, it'll be good if this is a healthier and better population and they are receiving great treatment and they've got their anti-malarial drugs, not just in the winter time of the year where there isn't any malaria, but in the summer of the time when there's lots of malaria, but it's difficult to distribute the drugs. That's great, but if it doesn't come back to the mission, then we failed a little bit in that. So somehow we need to be able to measure that. Yeah.
And from our perspective, our focus will be at the health centers and using our expertise to build health capacity and sustainable health capacity that will live beyond, I don't know if we'll get 25 years, but long enough so that we really make a difference. But for me, one of the measures of success for this partnership is something that Paul alluded to, and that's the communities and the connection to the communities. If we leave and they think it was just Americares or just African Parks, then we have failed. But right now, it's the African Parks community liaisons who are introducing us to the Ministry of Health and bringing us to the clinics in greatest need and starting the conversation. And we're going together with their branded cars. And so I hope that by the end that they will know that it's African Parks and all of their capacity, which is incredible. What they've built in the middle of Chinco, which is the large park in the middle of CAR, out of nothing in 3 years is unbelievable. We couldn't work there without them. And so what I hope is the communities will see how much African Parks cares about the animals and the people and how much we care at helping them succeed in their own lives.
I have a question about stories. So one of the things that we've heard today is that this can't be a conversation about the polar bears, or in this case, the lions, right? But the reality is that right now that is what the conversation's about. That's how we identify. So how can we make connections between, for example, your efforts to build schools in that area and then connecting it to building healthcare centers in that area? How can we connect that to the story of the lions? What is the immediate bridge that people might be able to see?
Yeah.
One of the things, so in this case, I get
I like to think about things.
Yeah. And I like to. One of the things that I was really struck going to visit the parks in Malawi is they already have that interface with the educational system, and they're very proactively bringing the students in to see the parks, to see the wildlife. When I lived in Kenya, I can't tell you how many Kenyans I knew that had never seen a lion or a gazelle or anything else. And so that's the connection. It's not only getting them schools, but in that educational endeavor, making sure that they have school trips that bring them into the park to see what an incredible resource their wildlife is. And so it was really, each of them had an educational center for kids, for adults, and it was awesome. I'd bring my kids there.
It is so important to connect with them. That's why I say connecting with a mission. You know, it's just teaching children is a good thing to do. We've got to teach children and make sure that in the process that they are connecting back with the park, so that, you know, if there is a politician or if there is a movement that says, you know, let's get rid of this park and mine it or do whatever, you want them to be the constituency for the sustainability, for the perpetuation of that park, to create that ownership. It's something where it is not obvious. It's something where a lot of people don't have it. You know, lions kill people, elephants stomp on people and eat their crops. So they are quite often coming from almost like a negative value from a cost perspective. And it's very important that we get that into a positive perspective. And it is long and it's slow. Yeah.
So, is this mic on? Yeah. Am I next? Yeah. So this is terrific. I really loved this this body of work. It's very, very impressive. My question is going back to the that story about giving fish and teaching people to fish and all of that. And I just wondered another version of that is going in and asking people how great-grandfather fished or how great-grandfather managed the forest and the jungle and the river or whatever. Do you guys take that approach too?
Yes, we do, and it's something where, again, it's a little site-specific. So I'm going to answer it positively, and then I'm going to give you the other side of the story. So in a place like Western Zambia, it's possibly the oldest national park in the world, even older than your own Yellowstone. There's a bit of dispute about when it was actually established. The Zambians will tell you it was before Yellowstone, but it was about the same time. But everything that was done around that park was done on traditional utilization and a whole series of rules and regulations, right down to where a particular headman was responsible for eland as a species and its conservation. And those kinds of things have been worn down over time. But if you identify what they are, you reestablish them, and often that needs a little bit of help and a little bit of facilitation. And so even though that the pressures have changed over time, it's something where by bringing that kind of, if I say, cultural component into the management of the land and the management of their own resource, it's a very effective way of doing it. I said there's another side to it, though. And the other side to it is, look at a country like Ethiopia. Ethiopia, 84, 85, at the height of the environmental crisis and the whole food aid, had 35 million people in it. Ethiopia now has 100 million people with a 98% land conversion rate. So it's something where Ethiopia has lost its ecological resilience to be able to do any of these things. What that means is that with the loss of the resilience, any tweak, any change in environmental conditions, where does that change manifest itself? If you look at the whole belt where the Sahel is starting to move south, people talk about the religious stuff between the Muslims and the Christians. It is only an environmental issue. It is only about the drying up of the grasslands of the Sahel and these huge herds of cattle that are basically then moving south. And yes, it does happen to be mostly Muslim-owned people that have these cattle that then are moving south, and hitting the Christians. And guess what? There's the most incredibly unpleasant wars and fighting that are taking place, and it's across 16 countries, and it isn't being spoken about anywhere in the international media. People are literally dying by the day from this. So what I'm trying to say is that the conditions that we're living in today are so different from what they were 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And we've got to factor those kinds of things into the way we're doing things at the moment. Yeah. Yeah. And it's challenging. And seeing as there isn't another question, I'm going to just follow on from that. It's sorry, Penny. Just very quickly before I come to you, the role that a lot of your government here, the European Union, has seen for conservation, the stabilizing force on that entire belt. That's the way they view it. Not from a conservation point of view, not from an elephant point of view, but from stabilizing incredible regional instability. Yeah, Penny.
Hi. I was thinking about the cattle because when I was in that park in Malawi, I saw the cattle herders right up to the fence.
Yeah.
And I thought about the transmission of disease between animal and humans because they have cattle, livestock, then they have all these wild animals that are crossing over and poor sanitation. So I was thinking about the transmission of disease across those lines. And then I was wondering, all the fires, every park that I've been to, you see the fires in the background, you see the smoke and the charcoal and the cattle, where it's weird to see cattle there in these places, and no one's replanting the trees. And is there any effort to reforest the decimation of the landscape to help people, like in that microfinance model, to help them help themselves, like replanting? Or is there anything we can do? Is there any kind of synthetic wood or something we can bring in, or stoves that, I don't know?
You've probably touched on at least 10 critical issues there.
Just 3.
And what I'm not going to do is answer them all, but the important thing is that if you have a presence of professional, able people, you have the foundation on which you can identify all of those issues and then start to solve them. So irrespective of what it is, I mean, I can tell you now, if you look at the heat map, the heat signature across Central Africa, the entire Central Africa burns, every last square kilometer, except 18,000 square kilometers of Chinko. It's only 18,000 square kilometers of the whole of Central Africa that doesn't burn. Why? Because you have a management presence and the ability to affect the outcome. Yeah, as well as all those other issues that you raised. Yeah.
I'm going to try and address 3 things really quickly. I heard more than a decade ago about a very interesting AIDS-related project. It was specifically designed for identified AIDS orphans, and it asked these children to plant and protect trees, and they were using the carbon reimbursement to then give them, if that child kept that tree alive and growing, every year they would get just enough money to pay for their school fees. So you got reforestation, you got the poorest and most needy of the children a way to continue doing their education. And I'm going, oh, this is a superbly awesome opportunity. I think the point that you raised that we haven't had barely a moment to talk about is that interface between people and animals and the likelihood that our next great global pandemic is going to come from all of the viruses and diseases that are sequestered now inside like the Congo Basin and the Amazon Basin, and they're going to be new to us and they're going to be dangerous. And so we have to think about that animal-people interface and be ready to address those kinds of things. And the third is one of the interesting opportunities, again in Chinko. They've got the nomadic herders coming across from Sudan and Ethiopia, and they've been coming into the park and competing with the animals. One of the things that we've talked about Americares could potentially do is do mobile medical along the edges of the park. So when the nomadic herders, when their cattle come, instead of coming into the park, they're going to stay along the edges because those will be the places where they can get the health care that they need. So in the partnership, we're directing those nomadic herders around rather than in. We're providing health and we're protecting the animals, and it's just a really exciting concept.
Can I just tell a very quick anecdote, because then I see that we're short on time.
Yeah.
So in discussions in our one park in Zambia, in Bangweulu, we're discussing the whole problem around HIV/AIDS and the fact that it was so prevalent in society. And one of the the Indunas, as like a chief of the area, said, well, what we need is for African parks is to reintroduce lion back into Bangweulu. And we said, well, that's a strange thing that you got all these people, and generally people don't like lions, and how's this linked to HIV? And he said, well, that's when HIV became a problem, is when lions went extinct, because then people started wandering around at night, and that's what spread the HIV. So
Okay.
okay, maybe.
I'm your human time reminder. I just want to thank you, Peter, and thank you, Anne. We're excited to learn more about the partnership. We're going to toast it in a few minutes in the other room so we can continue this conversation, but thank you so much. Really appreciate it.